Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to Block 4 of our second day of our Office of Indian Education Project Directors meeting. Today, you are tuning in to Growing Sovereignty in K-12 Curricular Initiatives. Before we start, I just want to remind everyone that you do have the option to chat. This is a space for you all to get to know each other, discuss the material you're hearing, and also if you have any questions for our presenters today, at the end, I will pass them to our presenters to have a fun webinar today full of information and ways that you can go back to your community and make a larger impact as well. And so today, please join Dr. Bang, Dr. St. Clair, and Dr. McCoy as we are going to talk about their efforts and discuss their efforts to build curricular structures that center Indigenous perspectives and resources for educators and families. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Bang, Dr. St. Clair, and Dr. McCoy to introduce themselves, and we can begin this amazing time together.
Bonjour, Badabin Indigenous Cost Initiative. Hi everyone, my name is Megan, and I'm really happy to be here with everyone. Meredith, am I supposed to do my slides or should we each introduce ourselves?
I think let's go ahead and I'll say hi and then we'll run through the slides.
Okay.
All right. Hami takiapi ampetikin chante washte na pe tu zambie. Ye kiapi de mie washichu ia Darlene St. Clair e makiapi. Damakota chanshai pi matahawana check pa untue edwati. Wana ikchewi chasha wa unspewi chakia himacha St. Cloud unspe wa kantia et Chtwani. Hello, my relatives. I'm Ye Kiapiwi. My Washichu name is Darlene St. Clair. I'm Dakota. I'm originally from Chanshaipi, which is where the Lower Sioux Reservation is located. So I'm originally from Lower Sioux. I live in the Twin Cities and I'm a teacher. I teach Native Studies at St. Cloud State University, which is a university here in Minnesota.
Bonjour, and then I'm Meredith McCoy and Ishnakas, Chijak Nadodam, Nakamaji Mekanakoju Gai Babakangandao. Hi everyone, my name is Meredith McCoy. I am Turtle Mountain Ojibwe. My dad, David McCoy, is a citizen at Turtle Mountain. I live in Minneapolis, where I teach Native Studies at Carleton College. Glad to be here. So today we're going to spend some time learning about 3 different projects, and then we're going to walk through a set of dialogues together as a group. So we'll be thinking about our process for preparing these respective projects, what it means to represent sovereignty in these projects to students, and then what the ramifications of each project has been.
So I get to start, and I'm going to present a project called Learning in Places. And you can go to the next slide. And I'll just say that this project is really about trying to bring earlier work and work that was developed in out-of-school places with Indigenous communities into school-based settings, where really I had tribal leaders that said, what you're doing outside of school is beautiful, and we have to figure out how to get our schools to be able to do this too. And so this is a project that's focused, you can go to the next slide, that it's, oh, it's so weird. This is our leadership team, lots of people doing lots of good work. Go to the next slide. So what is Learning in Places? It's really actually a project that we call co-design. It's been co-developed with families, with educators, with community-based organizations and leaders that is interested in a model of field-based education that is also transdisciplinary, meaning it integrates science, social studies, literacy, and civics. And we're being really deliberate about trying to figure out a model where what I like to tell people is Indigenous presence is normative, and it's a model that helps produce just and sustainable worlds. So it's not an Indigenous specific model. And you can go to the next slide. Oh, this is what I was saying, is it really, this project came from leaders, and Senator John McCoy was a mentor and sort of said, like, we need to figure out systematic ways to intervene. And so really this project was birthed of people saying, like, great, how do we do this at scale? Next slide. And so this project right now, it's a 5-year project. We're pretty early still. This year we were in 5 states and ended up with around 52 different districts. And next year we'll be in additional, we'll be in 7 states. So we're in Illinois, Michigan, Washington, Louisiana, and we'll be in New Mexico, Oregon, and Colorado next year. Working with this model, continuing to refine it, and build out relationships. We're working with tribal schools and departments of education in those states as well. Go to the next slide. And I just want to say, while this is focused on PK5, it's a model that has developed and works with middle schoolers, high schoolers, and actually we have lots of undergraduate folks using it. We have informal educators. And what we've really been trying to do is figure out what is a model that actually thinks about a systems intervention rather than sort of tinkering with pieces, which is oftentimes what we have to do in schools. And these are examples of like, here's the family storyline, and here's an example from an undergraduate professor who's using it with his class, and some of what undergraduate students are producing with it. And so I just want to say it's a bigger kind of thing, and it's interesting that way. And then the last thing I'll just say, you can go to the next slide. What is it? So it is curriculum, but it's not actually how we talk about it and think about it. It's more of a model. And we have a bunch of educator frameworks that are big ideas that are instantiated in kid thinking, in classroom vignettes, in self-assessments, and ways to help teachers plan. But it's also a set of, we do it through what we call storylining, which is a push on sort of how our curricular units developed and from what sensibilities. And then we have 10 what we call bundled learning engagements. And the whole reason this is because this model is getting people to learn on and with land and waters, not only about them. And I can say more about that, but really we're after curricular materials that support learning on and with land, not about lands. You do that too. And I have lots to say about why, for me, this piece about Indigenous presence always is what sovereignty actually would look like in our school systems. And pedagogies that are on and with land are necessary, I think, for us to be exercising sovereignty and self-determination, because us not learning on and with our lands has been because of colonial intervention. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm going to be talking about a 6th grade social studies curriculum project that I have located in Minnesota, Makoche. Go to the next slide. So I'm working with an organization, a Native nonprofit called Dakota Wichocha, which translates to Dakota Lifeways, Dakota Ways of Life. And it's a nonprofit organization, but we work across both tribal and colonial boundaries. And the focus of the organization is to revitalize Dakota language and lifeways. That work is organized around 3 concepts: Kiksuya, that's to remember; Kiwashte, to reclaim. We think of that reclamation specifically as being our language, our lifeways, and that relationship that we have with our homelands. And then Kichiwashte, to reconnect. And we think about our reconnecting with the relationship that we have to ourselves as Dakota people, our families, our Tiwahes, our community, and the land, a reconnection to that relationship. And you can go to the next slide. So this is really, researchers often call like their projects interventions, but I really think of this as an intervention in the way we understand it, and just that it's interrupting, especially interrupting erasure. So it's a 10-lesson curriculum that focuses on Dakota relationship to land and all of our relations within the land. But it is also trying to encourage all students who take the curriculum to reconsider their relationship to the land. Our goals is to center Dakota experiences and voices, to assert Minnesota Makoche as a Dakota place, to portray the history of Minnesota Makoche as a shared history, although not experienced in the same way, to address invisibility experienced by many Native students, and to be taught throughout Minnesota Makoche. Go to the next slide. So the curriculum is looking at things like highlighting community voices. So I would say that that the curriculum is built around sort of sharing and a deeper understanding of Dakota philosophy or traditional teachings. And of course, that's not a thing that you can just find in a book. That's information you would need to get from communities. So we went to communities to get this information. That is the sort of grounding of the curriculum. So it highlights community voices. We use oral ways of knowing and learning, specifically Wicho Oyake, which are kind of historical stories of Dakota people, as well as a prior oral history project that Dakota Wichocha, the organization, had done. We're thinking about storytelling or that oral ways of sharing as a pedagogical tool, as well as sense of belonging. And typically, I mean, the sense of belonging question is something lots of educators are thinking about, but usually when they think of belonging, they think of that belonging as a belonging to the class community or the school community. And we're really thinking about a sense of belongingness to the land. We're encouraging all students that take this course to see themselves as part of the story of Minnesota Makoche, both Indigenous and settler students. And we provide a lens or window for students to consider the historical and contemporary Native experience, and to do that always in reflecting on the other topics that would come out in a social studies curriculum. So in Minnesota, 6th grade is when we learn Minnesota state history. So we have paired this curriculum with the commonly used Minnesota state history, knowing that that history is never going to be positioned to teach what's in our curriculum, but that our curriculum also is recognizing what is being done in the state social studies curriculum. You can go to the next slide. So one of our lessons, for example, is called Minnesota Makoche. And Minnesota Makoche means the land where the waters reflect the skies or the clouds. Mini means water, sota is cloud-colored, cloud-tinted, cloudy, and then Makoche means land. So we're thinking about teaching about this concept of Minnesota Makoche as being more than the colonial borders of the state of Minnesota. In fact, and for a Dakota understanding, our lands exist beyond that colonial border. So we are talking about Minnesota Makoche as the Dakota is the homeland of the Dakota people. And then we've used backwards design in developing this curriculum. So there are essential questions. How do we know that Minnesota Makoche is a Dakota place? What kind of relationship do Dakota people have to Minnesota Makoche? And then next slide, just another example of one of our lessons is about Dakota have a significant and sovereign connection to Minnesota Makoche. So this is built into the lessons. The idea of Dakota people having a long time but ongoing interest in their homelands, that we have been here a long time and we are still here, that federal Indian policy had impacts on our exercise of our own sovereignty, but we still have sovereign governments, and even thinking about sovereignty in that really kind of broader sense of a deep and ongoing connection and responsibility relationship to our homelands. Next slide. I think that's it. Yeah.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that we've been doing in Chicago. Next slide, please. So about now 4 years ago, we started having conversations, myself, the Newberry Library, which is one of the nation's oldest independent libraries, and the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative, about whether there would be a community desire for a project that would use the archival resources of the Newberry Library to make the thriving urban Native community in Chicago more visible. This was recognizing that the Newberry has a wealth of resources, some that have been donated directly by the community and others that have come in through other sources, that the community sometimes has access to and sometimes doesn't. And so we had a series of community convenings, you can go to the next slide, to think about how do we represent all of the histories that are Indigenous histories relative to Chicago, understanding Chicago as a place that always has been and always will be a Native place, a place that's been a crossroads for many communities and that remains within the homelands of many nations. Next slide, please. So in those community conversations that we were having, we identified a set of priorities, and those priorities were to situate Chicago as a place that has always been a Native place, to serve a broad and multi-generational audience with whatever outputs of the project might come to exist, to grow a community archiving practice across organizations, recognizing that not everybody knew even where the archives were located, to support the growth of the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative, to make the invisible visible in terms of making sure that folks understand the lived experiences of Native folks in Chicago and advancing the priorities of the Chicago Native community as we understand them through collaboration with our partners. Out of all of these, we decided to develop in collaboration with the community an updated oral history project to update a project that was done in the 80s, a set of digital maps, a set of curricular resources, an exhibition that'll be housed at the Newberry, and then some associated public programming. So out of those various project facets, we decided that the curriculum will really emphasize increasing the visibility of Native histories in Chicago, that we would do that through a set of 7 inquiry design modules using primarily items out of the Newberry archive, and that we would focus our efforts on helping teachers share those histories of Native Chicago with their students to help expand a broad understanding of Chicago as a Native place. Next slide, please. So we had those initial listening sessions in January 2020, and then of course COVID happened and things shifted quite radically. We started doing virtual sessions with anybody who wanted to join, and out of those we identified a set of community members who might come on board to serve as an advisory board. We ended up with about 25 community members representing more than 15 Native nations. We have folks who are based in Chicago and also tribal council members and TIPOs and tribal education department staff from Kansas, Nebraska, Ontario, really from several removed communities. Those advisory board members that came on board then subdivided into project specific subcommittees. So I lead both the oral history and the curriculum subcommittee. You've got a list there of our current and prior members. You might see some folks that you know. We've been meeting as a curriculum subcommittee monthly. And through that, you can go to the next slide. Through that, we've developed first a set of priorities for the curriculum that was based also out of a survey that we did for the community that we distributed both virtually and as a physical copy of the survey. We identified the set of texts that the community wanted us to include and ran that through in terms of like what the source material was that we were going to use for the modules, ran that through a bunch of community listening sessions. And then we've also presented at some local gatherings for CAKE and for other community organizations. Next slide, please. So in addition to the in-person and virtual listening sessions, we also established monthly kind of virtual brown bag lunches. We've continued to meet as the advisory group and subcommittees. We ran that community survey and have had now a couple of whole community gatherings. We also developed a teacher pilot program where we're currently compensating 8 teachers in the Chicago region to test the resources so that hopefully they'll come back in a strengthened format that are more accessible to teachers and students. Next slide, please. And the components are asking kind of big thorny questions. How do we know Chicago's a Native place, right? What is the wealth of oral histories and resources that tell us that this is always and always will be a Native place? How have folks reacted to social disruptions and advocated for their own rights? And how have shifted political developments in the region affected not just humans, but also our lands and our relationship with them? Next slide, please. So at this point in our time together today, we're going to shift into a set of 3 conversations between the 3 of us, now that you've got sort of an overview of who we are and what we're working on. In this first question, we want to think about how our processes for developing our respective projects centered and respected tribal sovereignty. So I'll just open up the dialogue. Megan and Darlene, if you want to come off mute, we'll just have some time to think through this first question of what our process was like.
So I can just talk a bit about the development of my Minnesota Makoche curriculum. So in 2008, the Minnesota State Legislature, after I've been told 25 years of lobbying from Native nations, passed a piece of legislation that mandated teaching about the tribes and communities of Minnesota. And these got sort of, and essentially you had to bring this into your standards every time the standards were reviewed, which is typically like 10 years. So at that point in 2008, the arts were the first standards that now had these new, or the arts was the first sort of subject area that had these new standards brought in. And people in Minnesota, teachers were like, I don't know how I'm going to teach this. This is nothing that I learned in my own K-12, or nor did I learn this in my teacher preparation program. So Dakota Wichoha, the organization, was just getting inundated with questions. And I think when I talked about the organization, I said that really most of our work is inward facing. Our work is really focusing on Dakota people, the needs of Dakota people. Our projects are Dakota centered for Dakota people. But they decided that this would be the first and primarily the only project that the organization did that was kind of outward facing. There were some other folks within the organization that kind of started this project up, but I became the project lead shortly thereafter. So this comes out of a Dakota organization that is closely affiliated with the tribes of Minnesota. So the needs for it really are external, but it is a recognition that the tribes want to see their stories reflected in the curriculum. So I feel like that is sort of centering, that is why this project exists, is really an issue of sovereignty, especially in Minnesota. The Minnesota Indian Affairs Council represents all of the tribal leaders, and they had been advocating for 25 years for that educators would do better by teaching about Native people. And this is a long time coming, this process.
Maybe I'll just add, so I was working in Washington State for about a decade, where in some ways there was already the curriculums that tribes had made around social studies and history. And I am primarily, well, I was doing a lot of science education and teacher training. And one of the things about PK5 educators is they have to teach it all. And what we wanted was a model that allowed for educators to weave histories and to see how tribal histories were central. That if you're learning about land, you should be learning about Indigenous people. Science is a place where actually a colonial narrative is reproduced all the time. So when we were actually writing the curriculum, we were in partnership with tribal communities and thinking about how do we build a model where the particulars, like Darlene is talking about, is not on us to write, but can help develop educator support to say, I'm in Dakota territory, or I'm in Muckleshoot territory. I have a model that helps me know when and how to teach those specifics and connect it to all the other subject matter that I need to teach. So for us, one of them is that we created a model that deliberately said it's actually not our job to write the curriculum of everybody. And can we create the conditions where educators are always looking to projects like, Darlene, what you're saying? And then for us, it was really about intervening in the ways that science is a key site, in my view, of perpetuating attacks on sovereignty and governance of territory. So in our model, we have ethical decision making and deliberation as always one of the things that has to come out. And so we've sort of baked in, what does it mean? Kids have to learn about sovereignty, what it means to share territory, what it means to govern territory when they're asking questions about scientific phenomena, as an example. Just to say, we have families and communities that co-write everything. And they may not be the ones that type, but we will have what we call design summits, where we'll spend days together talking through things, whether it's producing transcript or creating notes. And then we produce it and it goes back for community review. And I just say that because I think the writing process question here, we might call that writing, but I appreciated, we do a lot with oral writing, right? Or the oral sharing. And then what does it look like to create curricular materials that are paper and written in ways that do right by that oral sharing of knowledge is something that we've worked hard to infrastructure in our projects too.
I really appreciate that, and thinking about what co-writing can look like with community. So Megan, thank you for raising that. I think for us on the Indigenous Chicago project, where we've been trying to be thoughtful, is there are so many different communities that claim Chicago as their space, right? The contemporary community, all of the communities that were removed from the broader Chicago area. And so we tried to be really intentional when we were getting started about who were we doing outreach to get input on the project, and how are we developing sustainable procedures for accountability and oversight. So that's been making sure that we do have ongoing dialogue with the TIPOs and the tribal ed folks and the tribal council members from the various removed communities that want to have say in it, how we make sure that we are being appropriately engaging with community structures that already exist in the urban Native community, and making sure that we're amplifying those priorities and showing up in a way that is supportive where it's appropriate. And certainly being sensitive to how The Newberry Library, my position as somebody who's coming in to be supportive, how we are not decision makers in the community, that we see ourselves here as folks who are facilitating the development of resources and doing some of that work of taking what the community is telling us they need us to create and then making it and bringing back drafts for their oversight. So what I'm hearing across our 3 projects is a commitment to listening to community and making sure that those priorities are coming out in the output of what we're developing. Other thoughts about our respective development processes? Okay, then I think we can move to the next question.
One other thing that I just want to elevate for this group, Darlene, I really appreciate the complicatedness of both having organizations that are focused on our own communities and our own people, and then the demand. And it just reminds me, like, for me, that has always been a very complicated demand, because I think we recognize that our schools have our babies, and our schools educate not our babies, who then can impact all of us. And so I just want to say that I think it's not quite the writing process, but there is something there about continuing to hold what that infrastructure demand is, and how do we, I don't know, I always think about, like, how do we build better in ways that can support the overly demanding kinds of things, because I also think schools shift so fast. It worries me, to be honest. Standard shifts, standard implementation doesn't always work. What teacher ed can do shifts, like those shifts. And sometimes I worry about producing things that will have short life courses, but took a lot of our labor. And I just to say, like, I wonder about continuing to think about this and what it means to be interfacing with systems that maybe don't care about our labor or our energy levels.
Yeah. Oh, and they don't. And I even, when I think about the amount of effort, Dakota Wichohan, we got grant funding to pay for this. This is not even where we got settler institutions to pay for all this and we did the work. No, we found the money to do it as well. And it has ongoing costs and ongoing effort to sort of keep it updated and to nurture and maintain and take care of it. So it does not feel like a just system, but the flip side is that I think the organization and Dakota people in general also know there's a cost to non-Native society not knowing about us. And that cost is very, very high. And so I'll often in my trainings, when I'm training teachers, say, I love all you 40-year-olds, you're great, but I'm investing in 6th graders. Because I feel like the 6th grade is where I'm going to get the bigger impact on my work. If I invest in 6th graders, I believe if these 6th graders, and these are Native and non-Native both, if they grow up in a system where they start to read Native experience through a lens of Dakota philosophy, that they're going to raise their children differently, they're going to vote differently, they're going to live on the land differently. They're going to interact with their Native neighbors in different ways. And I'm taking the long haul. I'm waiting for those kids to be more empowered. And so it is not a just system that we've got going. If I were to stop and think about it too often, it would really upset me that we put so much time and energy and labor into something that is really primarily a gift for the larger public. I agree.
That actually moves us really smoothly into our next dialogue, which is about what we say to students in our respective projects. So if we'll go to the next slide. Megan and Darlene, I'd love to hear you think about, how do you think about what your students are learning, what the students and young ones who are experiencing your resources, what are you hoping that they get out of that, and how do you think about what you're putting in front of them?
I can talk a bit about it. What I've observed, I think that what our intentions, the team of people who worked on the development of this curriculum, the team of people, we kind of had certain things that we expected that the curriculum would result in. And what we're finding is that these traditional teachings and these ways of learning makes sense to lots and lots of kids. And it's just a reminder that the standard does not work for lots of kids, not just Native kids, not just students of color. And so we see in these classrooms, students like really delving into and digging into sort of what their own values are. What do they stand for? What would they put them, where do they stand on issues? And because one of the things we teach about is Dakota worldview, we talk about specifically several different Dakota concepts like Mitakwie, Owasi, all my relations, but we also talk about one that is about humanity, our common humanity. And when we teach about these things, for sixth graders, this is the right time because they are deciding who they are as independent people. They are deciding how do they read somebody as having integrity, somebody they can believe and trust, and somebody, I think the sixth grade term for not having integrity would be like faith, but like what they want to be people in integrity. And so when we talk about traditional Dakota values, but they're not just a thing that you parade and say, I believe in honesty and respect. It's about you have to now live according to your stated values. How do you make decisions according to your stated values? And sixth grade is a good time. That's where they're doing a lot of internal work and developing themselves as individual human beings at this time. And so I have found that the curriculum makes sense to students in many more ways than we ever imagined or intended.
Yeah. I'll just build on that. I was exactly what I was going to say is that I think we actually start with more of like, what is personal sovereignty and self-determination, and what does it mean to be a good human being in right relations? And we find as preschoolers, I might not use that exact language, but human beings are actually ethical beings. And I think part of what the challenge becomes is that our systems have muted that and our children are starving for it. And our children there is Native and non-Native. So I really appreciate the kind of ethical demand that is actually childhood, trying to figure out the world and what it means to be good is what children want, I believe, and we start there. We do spend time talking about Indigenous civics for us with Native students and thinking about what does it mean to understand, do you have a role and a responsibility to the collective or to individual self, and then understanding political sovereignty. And we try to do the work of helping children think through and understand first that good human being and what it means to live a good life, but also how do they start to see what is sovereignty in the political sense? Why do we need it? What does it mean to uphold everyone's right to self-determination? And then also, we spend time, especially with the younger ones. I mean, I'll just say in Learning in Places, PK5, middle school, high school, college, we can go really fast. Like we often get people and want them to ask, what does sovereignty mean in this instance? So we kind of have this thing that sovereignty is always around. And our work is not to always define it, but to help them think in sovereign ways or to think about what it means to uphold sovereignty in any context they're in. So I'll just say that like we've been playing with that a little bit. I do want to say though, there are some core ideas that I find challenging, and I'd be curious. Most children don't understand Indigenous sovereignty, and they tend to have a race lens and an equity lens based in race very early. Like by first or second grade, most children have gotten that. And the trickiness of taking seriously this teaching about just being good human beings, interfacing with a racialized view of the world and the need to understand Indigenous sovereignty, particularly for me in classrooms that have Native children, but also lots of recently immigrated Indigenous children from elsewhere whose indigeneity is currently being erased because they're being racialized as Latino, as an example. That complexity, I sometimes think it's the edge of things that I think are real in classrooms that we think about a lot. And this issue of understanding Indigenous sovereignty in a settler nation state, Indigenous sovereignty globally, and then understanding what it means to have kind of a racial equity lens intersecting with that kids can get there. I find teachers struggle to figure out how to have these conversations in ways that don't actually trigger them. And I want to be clear about this. I mean Native teachers, I mean teachers of color, and I mean white teachers when I talk about this, because I think actually as adults we're fairly unpracticed at making sense of that complexity and are humanists simultaneously.
What I'll just add to that, really brilliant commentary from both of you, thank you, is that our curriculum is oriented at high school, but I was a middle school teacher, and what I find is that students have and whether it was my middle school students or now my college students, they have a really fierce sense that they have been deprived of historical accuracy in their curriculum. And so what we put in front of students when we're thinking about what's in Indigenous Chicago relative to kind of the nuts and bolts of governance is students are responding, and teachers alike are responding with the sense of, why wasn't I taught the place of tribal sovereignty within the way that governments work on this continent? And we are trying to have them think about that from a legal sense, and also to think about what that means in terms of who has decision-making status or authority within a given environment. So when we teach our unit that is about relationships to land and place, part of what we do is think about what relationships to land were like prior to the establishment of treaties. And so what the treaty negotiators brought with them in terms of philosophical approaches to land, and then therefore what the stakes were for each of those negotiating bodies. And coming out of those, how changes in land maintenance as a result of treaties then shifted the landscape in ways that affected not just humans, but also more than humans. And so we are thinking about sovereignty legally, and we're also trying to take a view that is broader, that thinks about ramifications for more than human relations, lands, and waters in addition to humans.
Meredith, just so we're not doing, so I really enjoy talking to the two of you, and it's fun to do. This fierce sense of being deprived, I find that to be true, even with little kids pretty quickly, because they've heard something else already, and then they learn something new, and then they wonder about, well, why did anyone ever tell me this other thing? And so I feel like what's interesting about this conversation a little bit is how the absence of us actually is creating in young people lived experience with the injustice in particular kinds of ways that I sometimes think we just don't collectively recognize, that actually our young people are experiencing the harm of the problem of our absence in complicated ways. And so I just really appreciate that fierce sense, because I think that I think one of the beautiful things we're seeing in investing in those sixth graders is I do think there is change happening. And I think young people are increasingly very aware of both problems of fakeness, frankly, but also problems of not honest or sophisticated understandings of very complicated interactions. And I think that has to do with, we've kind of had an implicit deficit model of what children are capable and what they want or could find interesting, right? And so I appreciate that fierce sense of, is partly an indication of like, they're ready for a lot more than we've been giving them. And then they're mad when they are like, oh, you really could have been doing more, rightfully, right?
Mm-hmm.
In one of the classes that was in our pilot cohort, in this concept of Ikchewichashta, it's a concept that many Dakota people are familiar with more in ceremonial purposes. We are not talking about that at all in the curriculum, but we're really thinking about the core of this concept. It means common person or common man. And we make sure that they understand when we say common, you know, we have, in those of us who have been socialized into the Western thought, think of that immediately as like commoner or like peasant, like there's a hierarchy of being with common people at the bottom. And in the Dakota, the teaching of this, the concept is you actually have to strive to become a common person. You have to work towards that And the way that you become a common person is to think about the ways that you've been dehumanized and the ways you've dehumanized others, and sort of grapple with that and make some sense of that. It is a common person is somebody who lives into their full humanity. And lots of Native nations have words to describe themselves as like true human beings or real human beings or the human beings or the original man or these kinds of things. I think all are getting at living into our full capacity as human beings. And so to give sixth graders sort of this understanding of like the ways that we have been dehumanized and the ways we've dehumanized others, the way we have undermined the humanity of other people through our history and in everyday acts, large and small. Once they get a sense of that, they grab onto that because they know what that is. They see it all the time. They just don't have a word for it. So in one of our pilot schools, this was a time when there was a big debates in the United States and discussions about immigration. And somebody in the class said something kind of callous about immigrants in this sixth grade class. And somebody else in the class said, I find that really dehumanizing. Like they now have words to sort of point out a thing that they had like discomfort. They might have maybe called it mean or something, but like now they had like a word to sort of describe it. And that came from a study of Dakota traditional teachings. And so I do agree with you 100. I mean, even my college students continually express anger and frustration about how much has been either kept from them or erased or they've just been given wrong information. And our young people are sophisticated thinkers, and they have the capacity to take on these and really bring these teachings into their lives. And this is Native and non-Native is what I'm talking about in the classes I've seen.
Mm-hmm. I think that the other thing that happens when we teach this kind of single narrative of US history that we've only exposed students to, right? This sort of dominant narrative that we've established through curriculum and standards. And there's really excellent scholarship out of social studies worlds from folks like Sarah Shear and Leilani Sabzalian thinking about erasure through textbooks and erasure through standards of Indigenous governance and Native histories. What happens when we allow all of that to become sort of our shared norm is that we foreclose for students the possibility to imagine other worlds. And so if we keep them stuck in this understanding of the past as, well, the United States just had to come into being. It was manifest destiny. It was divinely ordained. The violence that was associated with conquest was unfortunate, but was just what happens in that manifest destiny model. Then what we've taught students is that genocide is just a natural part of life. It's regrettable, but it's just what happens. And so providing these alternative histories allows students to refocus and to think about how that dehumanization does not have to be part of our lives. And we allow them then space to imagine the kinds of worlds they want to create.
Oh, 100%. I agree. I mean, in teaching about race, it is the one of the things that scares me the most is people's lack of imagination that there could be another way. And because that will really limit us into the future. My students will often say, racism has always been around, it's always going to be around. And it's like, well, that is a not understanding of history because it hasn't always been around. And if it hasn't always been around, we can envision a future without it. And this is just in classes about race. But I always think, I agree with you, Meredith, about thinking about Native like worldviews and philosophies and traditional teachings and experiences as being that alternative to this is the way it always has been and this is the way it always was. That's frightening to me.
I wonder if then we might continue that dialogue in our last discussion question, which is thinking about what the ramifications of our projects are for sovereignty moving into the future.
I mean, I can start. I think You know, I think a lot about climate change. I think a lot about how much what we often give to kids is asked to fix our current things with actually this future problems, I think is baked into how we do things. And our work and our project is really deliberate about cultivating that imagination about futures, and trying to think about like what do we need for 100 years forward, or 150 years forward, which is, you know, we all have teachings about that. But what I don't think we've done is bake that in. In fact, I think most of schooling bakes in what will be your job in middle adulthood so that you can be labor in a capitalist economy. And I'm not suggesting we don't want, everyone's always had job. There's always been economy. We've had our own economies. People need to do the work of living, right? So I want to say that. But how most of what schooling does is towards not our thriving as communities, not our thriving as human beings, and certainly not Earth's thriving, means that I think that what I spend a lot of time thinking about in our work is what does it mean to reimagine the purpose of education? And I think, you know, Darlene, I heard it, what you were saying, and I know, Meredith, your work, that all of us are designing curriculum or tools or models that is actually trying to move towards a different world entirely. It's not actually just representational. And I actually feel like that's important to say, because sometimes I think in school systems, we get trapped in kind of representational politics alone. And we have to deal with that in some ways, but that's not what I think is under this. And so, for me, I'm not sure that the word ramification has a little bit of a negative affect for me. So I'm like trying to work into it, because I think what you mean is, how does this expand sovereignty? How does it give us new lift? Or how does it help us accomplish the work of sovereignty in education? And the thing that I'll tell you, for me, I have this thing. Children are denied learning on lands and waters, all children, and it's hurting our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health, and our intellectual health. And so for me, our project's about saying and producing the ways in which we could actually have what we think about as porous learning, where we're in and out, where childhood has been constructed and been created into an indoor activity, right? It's not how anybody, right? Not anybody used to learn indoors to the extent that we do now. So my hope is that our work is helping to create the conditions where we could reimagine how we're infrastructuring the where of childhood alongside the what and the how of it. And so I spend a lot of time also having to recognize that even educators with great intentions and what I might call right politics don't know how to do it. So the other thing that I hope in our work is we're really trying to open up, like, what are new pedagogies that we need alongside the expansive content that we're talking about right now, and how do we learn to do it? And in my experience, part of what the issue is that we all do it, but we haven't had quite the space to unmute the language that names it. And so I was really appreciating that kids know it, right? Kids know things when it happens, and now they have language for it. Part of what I'm after is also kind of reanimating our own pedagogical language and helping more people both have the sensibilities, but also feel like I can do this in interaction with children and families and community in robust ways, that expand the how of teaching and learning. And it's partly back to my worry that sometimes when we focus on the what, the legislative systems of shifting what's, without really deepening the how, because I feel like if you get the how right, we can do really cool stuff with any kind of content, actually, right? And we can ask the question of sovereignty. I still think there's, so I want to be clear about this, and there's like literal histories that everyone needs to know. But for me in the work, I'm trying to be expansive to think about it across disciplines in that ways. Partly because I'll say, I think that without that, just as an Ojibwe woman and most of what I know about communities I've worked with, none of our knowledges work in the neat disciplinary boxes of the Western Academy or how schools structure it. So I'm also, for me, this reimagining that we could get to like not this broken up Western system is what I hope we actually demonstrate it's possible and maybe even better.
Mhm. What I try to remind my students of, Megan, that you just said so beautifully, is the technology of schooling that we currently use, where it's a box of a building, and there are chairs that are oriented in a certain direction and desks that are oriented in a certain direction, and there's a single pedagogue expert at the front of the room, and everyone else is just absorbing content. That's a really recently imported technology, right? In my family, on my dad's side of my family, my great grandparents were the first folks to engage that kind of technology, which means it's young and under development and we don't have to follow it, right? There are infinite other models of educating and raising young people to be healthy in themselves and healthy in community. And we don't have to use the one that we're currently looking at. And just because it sort of feels like, oh, well, this is the thing that we know, this is how we do schooling in the United States, doesn't mean that that's the way we have to do education in the United States. And I think what part of what you're naming that is resonating with me is that it really does take lots of these projects at once, right? We need, in the short term, the sort of curricular interventions that are about representation and getting other narratives that those core things that we need all students to know and all teachers to know. And then there are these other concurrent projects that we need that are creating alternative spaces. And now I'm going to speak for myself as an education historian. Our communities have always done that, right? Sarah Winnemucca was creating her own land-based school in her language at the same time that the federal boarding school system was operating, at the same time that there were Native teachers working from within the boarding school system to try and eke out some small safe spaces for Native kids. And so we've always in the history of Indigenous experimentation with schooling, since the advent of colonialism, we've always done all of these things concurrently. And I think that's part of the beauty of the three projects put in conversation on this panel, is they represent different facets of trying to do this all together. And the last thing I'll say about this is I heard our colleague and my mentor, Brian Braveway, talk about this at one point, and he talked about coalitions of conscience, right? That we need all different facets of this pushing on all sides at once to make meaningful change.
So, Megan, one of the things that I wanted to hold up about what you said is the ways that we are reconstructing childhood to be an indoor activity, but also an indoor activity managed and controlled by an adult. And I think all of us who work with young adults can put our finger on the fact that we are like getting in the way of our young people being able to solve problems by themselves, do things independently. I see it in my college students. I think that in terms of like future kind of impacts, I think Native people have always been, there's always a subtext that Native people are in the way of American progress. And that's been since the very beginning, throughout our history, and even today. When American progress wants to develop a pipeline, who's there to block it? Native people. When they want to do something, Native people are there to block it. So I feel like that is, whether people are always conscious of that, I think that is something that's subtextual, that's sort of in people's consciousness. And I'm hoping that these kinds of curricular interventions will help people understand that actually Native knowledge has solutions for our today problems and our future problems. That there are solutions and other ways of being in the world it's available. It is not a thing. I think we often look like, well, technology is going to fix it. Technology is going to solve this problem for us. But I really think we have so much throughout the Indigenous people of the world, their capacity to like offer solutions for the complicated problems that we're experiencing today and the ones that we'll continue to face into the future.
Yeah, I really, just to elevate that, Darlene, I really love that point. And I think it also speaks to a little bit around, I often show people that the edges of scientists know that Indigenous knowledge systems knew way more about our lands and waters than they did, right? And if you look at all of the most prestigious science articles, it's left and right about like new insights because of partnerships with tribal communities. Sorry, my dogs are going crazy, and I have a puppy that got out of her kennel and is not behaving well right now. And I think that one of the things is, right, is that because of the ways that we kind of regulate schooling, we often, sorry, um,
We can't really hear it, so don't worry.
okay, that's good. She's really barking obnoxiously. I just think that sometimes what also happens in schooling is also the way that we don't imagine our kids can take up really complicated content. We've kind of done that to educators too. We've kind of de-intellectualized educators or removed their persons. When I first started out as a Head Start teacher, and like I hugged kids, and the number of regulations that now prevent educators from being whole human beings with children is also like, so I guess I wanted to just say that I think the other thing here is that I think some of these movements, and I really love the sort of coalitions of conscious, actually help us we help each other become the humans, right? That we kind of all can continue to push each other into being that humble man, or that kind of teaching. Because I do think that educators are also often dehumanized through the systems that kind of codify in particular ways that, and I just wanted to hold that up because I just work with enough educators that, and also watch their kind of disfiguring that happens over time. It's really hard to be an adult with your own trauma and disfigured by systems, and then also open the space for young people. And I think educators right now, in particular, post-COVID, and some of the challenges in our systems right now make it a important job. I often tell my pre-service educators that our system is a little wacky because we think that engineers or climate scientists or heart surgeons are more sophisticated than educators, and their job is to do all things, because all you have to deal with whole human beings, not segregated parts of human beings. But it's not always how we treat educators.
I want to give a shout out to everyone in the room that's working on an OIE PD grant. I'm working on a PD grant on my campus. And while I so desperately want more Native people in the classroom, more Native people as administrators, I also really worry about that system and what that does to you. It's tough. I have, over the years, and I've worked with teachers for about 15 years, and I see the ways how dramatically the shifts have been to really like limit individual creativity, and with lots and lots of mandates, and it's very difficult. Yeah.
And I think what all of our kind of closing comments here are pointing us to is that when we're thinking about what sovereignty in education means, it does not just mean teaching students what sovereignty looks like right now, right? This has come up a couple times in this conversation today, is that we're thinking about what a more humanizing and just world for all of us, teachers, students, and the rest of the community might look like, and how our respective work with young people might advance the building of that kind of a future. Megan and Darlene, I don't know if you have any kind of closing thoughts you wanted to share, but I think for me, what I'm taking away from this conversation is just that a form of education, whether that is in classrooms, on the land, in whatever form of educational space we might be working, that centers Indigenous knowledges and systems of relationality and value systems, that can help work towards a different kind of future for all of us that might embody a different form of sovereignty in the days to come.
Love it, Meredith. Beautiful, 100%.
I think then we're ready to go to some questions from the audience. So Doris, take it away.
Hello. Well, before we begin, I just want to say, wow, what a enriching conversation. I was so sucked into the discussion, writing notes. Every time you guys kept saying next, I'm like, oh, I gotta click the button. because I was writing so fast. But we have tons of comments, tons of really great discussion that was going on with each other. And I just want to say thank you to those in the audience that took this time to really learn from each other. Our first question is, do any of you feel like your curriculum needs teacher professional development alongside it in order to teach with fidelity, or do you design PD alongside your curriculum?
Yeah, I'll just say for Learning in Places, it's a year-long PD. Most teachers stay in for 2. We really bake in, people can use it. But yes, I think if people pick and choose from our stuff, there's good stuff in there, people can do it. But it is fundamentally asking people to do things differently than how they have. And most of us need help learning to do things new. So yes, we bake that in. And I kind of think we should always be doing that. I often tell people I wouldn't go get heart surgery from a heart surgeon that hadn't had a year-long opportunity to learn in 25 years.
Mhm.
But somehow we treat educators like they should be able to learn all the complexity we ask of them in a 4-hour, once-a-year PD. And I just don't think it's the way to really dig in. So yes, we have lots of PD that goes with it.
We do as well. And I just want to say I'm envious to have a year of access. You saw Megan's curriculum, it's massive, right? I have a 10 lesson unit and you cannot do it without being trained. So the way that we have set it up is if you pay for the training, you have forever access to the curriculum, even as it changes over time. So, and that is because when we had our very first pilot, we had given it to 2 different teachers and said, okay, try teaching this and let us know how it goes. One person looked through it and said, this is so far afield from anything I've ever done or learned about, I can't do it at all. And the other person was picking and choosing the parts that they felt comfortable with. So we learned that without professional development, the curriculum would not even be implemented fully. So we have mandatory training in order to even get access to the curriculum. You can't see the curriculum until you've gone through the training. So that's core. And that is just based on past learning.
For Indigenous Chicago, we're just at the beginning of starting to develop what that PD is going to look like. Darlene's on our advisory board, and Megan's been a wonderful mentor in thinking about some of these questions also. So we're just starting to figure that out. I'll say, given what we're seeing from our 8 teachers in our pilot program right now, we're hearing a lot of the same things that Darlene heard from her teachers. We don't even know where to start implementing this alongside the standards that we already have to deal with. So that, alongside the fact that most of the teachers that I have worked with or am working with themselves had no preparation in Native histories, and so they're trying to pick this up as they're teaching it to their students. I would love to connect with people who are thinking about PD in the Chicago area. We are really thoughtful too about what the existing structures are through districts, through schools, through unions, that might be other opportunities for partnership around developing PD for where teachers are already going for their additional training. So we slot that into a structure that already works for them.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is, what are the critical types of resistance or setbacks you have experienced, and how have you addressed those issues?
I'll just jump in real quick to say, I recently was experiencing some dialogue with a teacher who told us that you could not ask U.S. history questions and teach them in a Native history with Native history answers. That they just weren't history questions, because we were trying to think about questions that were more interdisciplinary, and we're asking sort of like broader philosophical or thematic questions. And so helping teachers get past their kind of resistances where they're thinking about, I have to just do what's on paper and I can't be creative with my curriculum. So we're trying to be good thought partners there in helping teachers overcome that level of resistance. And then there's a whole other set of not wanting to look at things that feel like they disrupt the narratives that they believe to be true about the place where they live. And I know Megan and Darlene both have thoughts about that, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we've had some similar things. I mean, I think we see kind of sometimes what we've learned is like teacher capacity, and within that teacher capacity can be maybe like a subgroup of like resistance. Because we see that teachers who have good capacity, they have an awareness of Native experience, that they're comfortable talking about Native issues, Native people, Native concerns, that those folks, you know, they teach it in a way, they have a level of comfort, they have a level of engagement, they dig in, where I often see other teachers just doing the bare minimum, scraping the top, ignoring all the parts that maybe are a challenge to them, either a challenge to their sense of that they have to be an expert in all things, or a challenge even to their own belief system. So definitely there are those kinds of challenges as well. The other thing I would say is like before the curriculum, I often heard from teachers, because I've been working with teachers for a long time, we would do better. We know we should do better about teaching about Native nations of the state. We want to do better. We would do better if there was a really well-developed curriculum that was available. So then I'm like, I hear this for years and years and years, and I go and develop it. And then it's like, there's always an excuse. Oh, the social studies teacher is also a coach, and this is football season, and they can't do any professional development. So it's like, I kind of was naive in that I believed that if a really well-designed curriculum was made available to them, that there would be, but it still is, even with now the curriculum available, an effort for me and other folks to convince people to adopt it, convince them why they should take this curriculum on. And it's not mandatory, so it is really definitely a choice of a district to adopt or not adopt.
Yeah. I guess just to add to this, I would have started exactly where I feel like you both have started, a little bit around challenges. You know, I have seen some shifts in the last couple of years, the complicatedness of what's happening politically in the country about what you can teach. So I will just tell you, learning in places has been pushed out of some districts in some states, in particular ways. And so I also, so I raise that because it's such a different, interesting new form of challenge about what it looks like to support educators. Is one thing I just want to name. Like it's real. It's and in our work we're explicitly engaging in gender expansive pedagogies too, and thinking about what that means. And we have lots of educators where that is dangerous for them to do. And what it so I want to say that, like, the political and social context, part of why that is interesting to me and a challenge is helping educators know how to communicate across a diversity of families has been actually a new demand that I have to tell you, I'm not sure I did very well, and help them figure out how to manage the range of beliefs about many things. And so one of the things that I'll tell you that was not something that we knew we would develop is we have this whole suite of what we call family tools. And we've used that partly to help actually infrastructure the change in relations between educators and families that actually are necessary to do the kind of work that we're talking about, that our system doesn't ask. You know, by middle school, families maybe get 5 minutes with their teachers, right? Like we don't have a system that believes that relationships between schools and educators and families are really consequential. But we ask educators to know lots and lots and be in a kind of relation with kids, and especially young kids, that young kids shouldn't have to be the one to share. And so I say this because I think that these tensions alongside the actual just refusal problems is a matter of, actually, for us, these tools have been a way to help say to educators, actually, let's create tools and resources that help you continually be in good relations with your families. And so we've really worked to say, this is not homework. These are facilitative opportunities to build your relationships and get to know their expertise, their experiences, and navigate and support how school-based learning can actually enrich and be in relations with family-based learning that aren't from deficit places. And I got one, it's a really explicit tool development that we needed to do, because that major tension of the powered relationship between schools and families and communities, we kept smacking up against it. And we would get teachers that didn't actually espouse deficit beliefs, didn't didn't, right? Like we do have some teachers that did. Um, but they didn't have tools that help them move beyond value statement into practice statement. So that for me, I know I said a version of this before, but I'm sort of obsessed with like, how do we continue to build and think about what would enable educators to continue their growth trajectories? And I feel like even the resistance is a sign that educators are in systems that don't actually nurture their growth, that are inundated with too many demands. Like the scale of demands and the scale of regulation also atrophies. Like, I don't know if you all have tried to make something when there's 55 rules that you have to hold in your mind all at the same time while you're making something. Very hard to do, right? And so that tension for me is complicated because at the same time, we also know without those accountability systems, we've also seen deep reproductions of really egregious things. So, like I understand why they're there, and I'm not sure they're the thing that's going to get us to the future that I think we're reaching for right now. And the tension of the system that has been needed and the systems that we need is one that I continue to just struggle with figuring out what kind of, one step forward, two steps back, 5 steps sideways, like that kind of stuff is a tension. The other one that I do want to say, in our work, understanding that there are Indigenous peoples globally and the complete lack of awareness of that is a really big barrier. And we've been working on it to help understand, because I think what also is happening, I do a lot of work where there are Indigenous peoples from other places, or a lot of Indigenous folks from Central America that have been racialized into a particular categories whose indigeneity has been erased. We know that there's identity movements happening in those communities too. And the current way that they're being managed actually is through scarcity models. And so then it creates conflict between our communities. And that's been an historical kind of thing. So I just wanted to name that I think another major tension is a scarcity paradigm of change making that then we fight about things. And, sometimes I refer to it as the instructional minutes wrestle, right? Is that there is only so much time in the day, but our current distribution of our time pretty funky. And I think we got to worry about that a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we are nearing the end of our time, and we do have questions and chats. And so just to be, mindful of our time, I do encourage our presenters, if you would like to engage further with the audience, you do have the opportunity to go inside the Cvent platform and leave comments, type answers as well. But to those that are in the audience right now, here are our presenters' contact information. I know that there were some amazing comments, some great conversations in the chat. I encourage you to send your kind words to our presenters. I know that it's you all are native scholars, and you're doing work, you're researching work, you're advocating for your community, and sometimes you just need to hear how great you're doing. And so I highly encourage our audience to send your kind words, the things that you've been saying, to our presenters, and ask the questions that you asked us in the conversations. I want to say thank you, because this was an amazing time. Myself, I'm learning. I have a 6th grader myself. My kiddo is Indigenous. He is not only Shinnecock, but Chamorro. And so together was such a great conversation. Just for me and myself. So I can only imagine those on us today that have babies, that have kiddos, that even have, students. And so I really want to thank you so much for this time today. As we are going forward in our time, to our audience, please stay in touch. We are going to send out our recordings, and we have the PowerPoint inside of our chat as well for those that want to go back and learn more about the programs that our presenters have today. In the next 10 minutes, our day 2 roundtable discussion will start. If you love today's session, take it to the discussion board. Tell others about what you've learned. Encourage others to reach out to our presenters to learn more. Please download our files from our resource library. Follow up for questions if you need any. But that concludes our time. Dr. Bang, Dr. McCoy, and Dr. St. Clair, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for the words that you have inspired us today. And I am so excited to keep in touch and see how this progresses and how this can be replicated across Indian country. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. See you guys soon. Have a good day.